when a giant crocodile darted out of the water toward lone fisherman George Anderson. He was sure he'd meet his creator today. But to his surprise, the crocodile did not attack him. Instead, he seemed to want George to follow him. Did this animal need help with something? The whole scenario was just bizarre. But when George saw where the crocodile was leading him, it immediately became clear to him. George kept thinking what a stupid decision he made following that crocodile deeper and deeper into the swamp. It seemed like every cell in his body said no, no. But he kept going. George couldn't believe what he saw. He had followed this crocodile all the way to here, in the middle of the swampy nothingness. His heart stopped. Had this animal lured him into a trap? But then George saw it. It all became clear now why the crocodile had brought him here. He looked at the situation and saw what the crocodile wanted, or rather, what he needed. He shuddered at the thought of needing his help, and as soon as possible, he wanted to be away from there. But where had the crocodile taken George? Fishing is a hobby that George has been doing since time immemorial. Everyone knew that George Anderson loved fishing more than anything, but few understood the true reasons why. At age 55, he began to appreciate the quieter moments when he could just sit back and relax. And as much as he adored his family, there was one thing George never wanted them to know. But it was a secret that would soon be exposed. In Florida, the swamps can be dangerous. There are strange insects and wild animals that could suddenly appear. But George isn't worried about the risks and dangers. He is used to the swamps. After many years of fishing, George had seen quite a few animals. He stayed away from crocodiles and other animals, and they also left him alone. He believed in the saying, "Live and let live." It didn't seem that these animals were interested in him. They mostly kept to themselves, knowing that people always give more trouble than they are worth. George was glad of that, but not everyone felt the way George did. When the news reported that more and more crocodiles were being sighted in the part of Florida where George lived, he paid more attention to it. "I'm worried about it," he said. He thought the chances of anything happening to him were high. He intended to just avoid them, like every other time he'd encountered a crocodile while fishing. But George's wife said something very different about the situation. She wanted to give George a good lecture. George's wife had tried to convince George not to go fishing again until the crocodiles were less common in the area. She was concerned for his safety, and she knew George would not worry about it. George didn't want to stay in the house all day. He had been planning his fishing trip all week, and he refused to listen to what his wife had to say. He was too stubborn. Later, he would look back on that moment and wonder if something had gone wrong there. Maybe he should have listened to his wife. George would regret every moment he spent with that crocodile, who fixed his gaze upon him. George didn't know much about crocodiles, but he was confident he could handle one if he had to fight it. He knew enough to assume there wouldn't be a problem. When it was time to leave, he slowly started packing his things, confident that nothing would go wrong. During the drive to the lake, George had more time to think about what his wife had said and the situation with the crocodiles. His brain dismissed it as nothing to worry about. You wouldn't be attacked by a crocodile. George wanted to enjoy his day in the swamp, and no crocodile could take that away from him. George was so caught up in fishing that he sat back and forgot about the threat of the crocodile. George was thrilled to catch his first fish after just a few minutes of waiting. Just as George was celebrating his first catch of the day, the water began to slosh behind him. He didn't even have time to turn around before it all happened. Everything happened so fast that he barely had time to react. Suddenly, a huge creature jumped out of the water and grabbed onto the pier. George froze in shock, wondering if that would be the last moment of his life. He saw his life pass before his eyes in a flash. George squeezed his eyes shut as best he could. He knew he couldn't swim faster than a crocodile, and there was no way he could fight it if he did fall into the water. George resigned himself to his fate. He knew this was it. The crocodile lay right where he had landed, staring at him and waiting. It was like the crocodile wanted to tell him something but wasn't sure how. George tried to assess the situation. It didn't look like the animal was getting ready to attack him, but George knew it could get aggressive at any moment. He had to do something. He could run or investigate, and everything about this situation screamed, "Run!" The crocodile let out a growling sound that made George freeze. The crocodile didn't really seem upset. It was really like the crocodile was trying to tell him something. The beast clearly wasn't about to let him leave, but it wasn't trying to attack him either. George had no idea what the animal wanted. Did it want to play with him? He had never heard of crocodiles playing with their food. George looked around, trying to think of what the crocodile was trying to show him. He wasn't sure what prompted him, but he slowly reached out to see how the crocodile would react. The animal seemed almost happy. George stepped forward with his hand outstretched, and the crocodile seemed to come closer. He held out his hand until the crocodile was close enough to touch it. He couldn't believe he was doing this, but here he was, hand held out by a crocodile. He slowly rested his hand on the crocodile's nose. When George looked at the animal, the crocodile seemed pleased, but then the crocodile turned. George withdrew his hands in surprise, but stood still. George wondered if maybe he had been raised by humans and was no longer afraid. The crocodile finally stopped to stare at George. He didn't look away even after a minute or two. He really kept staring, and that scared George a little. Did the crocodile expect George to come along? When George took a hesitant step forward, the crocodile continued toward shore. George continued to follow the animal, which waited for him before moving again. It kept pace with George, a truly surreal experience. The crocodile seemed focused on a nearby clump of plants. At the end of the pier, George saw his truck and knew he could run for it. But what was the crocodile trying to do? George decided to follow the crocodile, which eventually led him to the baby who was injured. So that was it. For some reason, the crocodile wanted George to see that her child was in distress. George instinctively knew what to do. The baby lay in a hole in the dark part of the swamp. The crocodile didn't look too old, probably not more than a few months old, and was very small. He didn't look too good. His mouth was slightly open, and he didn't seem to move much. The still baby crocodile worried George. He didn't know what to do. He had never been in such a situation. Upon closer inspection, he saw that the baby crocodile's belly was moving, a sign that it was still breathing. At least the creature was still breathing. That gave George some peace. As long as it was alive, he knew there was hope. But George knew he couldn't just pick up the baby crocodile and walk away with it. He had to do something else. George decided it would be best to call the local vet first. He was far from being able to judge the condition of the baby crocodile, and he thought a vet would be able to give a better assessment. George turned on his phone and dialed the vet's number. He pressed call. The reception wasn't very good where he was, but the conversation came about anyway, and he got the vet on the phone. "Carlos," George began, "I have a strange favor to ask you." George started telling everything that had happened, from the moment he got to his fishing spot to the first encounter with the crocodile, and gave Carlos a description of where he was. "I'm in a remote part of the swamp," George said. "There's a baby crocodile here that needs your help." After giving Carlos some clues about his location, Carlos replied that he would be there soon. George just had to wait. Finally, the vet arrived at his location and saw the problem. The baby crocodile had a fever, and it was something that could be fixed quickly with some medication. He administered the necessary medicines under the watchful eye of the mother crocodile. Then George returned the baby crocodile to his very grateful mother. She gave George and the vet a long look, as if thanking them. Then she and her child retreated to the swamp. All is well that ends well.